The neon lights of Seoul streaked across the bulletproof glass of Kang-woo's Mercedes like jagged shards of electric blue and violet. For a moment, his own reflection was visible, a mass of cold, sharp angles and eyes that had seen too much blood to ever truly rest. But as the car glided past the edge of a quiet park in Gangnam, that reflection vanished, replaced by a sight that stopped his breath. Inside the vehicle, the air smelled of expensive leather and Baek Hae-rin's clinical, floral perfume. She sat beside him, the embodiment of a perfect, strategic alliance, her silhouette refined and her gaze suspicious. The massive diamond on her finger caught the passing streetlights, flashing with a hot brilliance that felt more like a shackle than a promise. The elders expect the merger to be finalized by Friday, Baek Hae-rin noted, her voice smooth and devoid of warmth as she checked her reflection. They believe consistency is the only way to build an empire that lasts. Kang-woo didn't answer. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way he hadn't felt in years. There, standing under the soft glow of a street lamp, was Octavia. It had been exactly 1 year since he had been forced to leave her to protect his position and her life. She looked calm and dignified, wearing a simple cardigan, her expression quiet but resolute as she gazed toward the city skyline. But it was her hand that drew his eyes, resting protectively, instinctively, over a visible, rounded pregnancy bump. The world outside the Mercedes seemed to slow to a crawl. Kang-woo did the math in an instant. The timeline of their final night together aligned perfectly with the life he saw before him. This wasn't just a complication, it was the one secret capable of destroying the ironclad throne he had spent his life building. Kang-woo. Baek Hae-rin's voice sharpened, her eyes moving from her phone to his face with dawning unease. Why are you slowing down? Is something wrong? He didn't look at his fiancée. He couldn't. All he could see was Octavia, the woman he loved, carrying the heir to a bloodline he had intended to let die with him. The cold luxury of his Mercedes suddenly felt like a tomb, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss felt the crushing weight of a crown he no longer wanted to wear. Kang-woo's hands, encased in the sleeves of a charcoal grey silk suit, gripped the wheel of the bulletproof Mercedes with a precision that bordered on lethal. Outside, the neon veins of Seoul's Gangnam district pulsed with a frenetic, electric life, violets, blues, and harsh embers reflecting off the polished black hood of the car. Inside the cabin, however, the air was vacuum-sealed and silent, smelling only of expensive leather and the clinical, floral notes of Baek Hae-rin's perfume. Baek Hae-rin was a portrait of calculated, icy perfection. She did not lean back into the seat, she sat poised, a woman who had been groomed for the weight of a crown since her first breath. Her dark hair was gathered in a sleek, architectural bun, and a massive diamond on her finger, a stone meant to finalize a blood alliance between two of the country's most powerful syndicates, caught the passing streetlights, flashing with a hard, cold brilliance. The elders are growing impatient, Kang-woo, she said, her voice as smooth and sharp as a scalpel. She didn't look at him, choosing instead to study her own reflection in the side window. They expect the merger to be finalized before the Lunar New Year. My father believes that stability is the only currency that matters in our world. Anything else is a liability. Kang-woo didn't blink. Liability. That was the word the family used for everything that didn't contribute to the throne, for every emotion that couldn't be quantified, for every dream that didn't involve expansion. For years, he had lived by that creed, carving away every soft part of his soul until only the steel remained. He had accepted this life, the strategic marriage, the cold duty, the endless maneuvering, because he believed there was no other version of himself that was allowed to exist. Stability is precisely what I am providing, he replied, his tone as flat and unyielding as the pavement beneath them. Hae-rin turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowed with a subtle, dawning unease. She was a predator in her own right, and she could sense the infinitesimal shift in the atmosphere whenever his thoughts drifted too far from the business of the syndicate. You've been distant. Even for you. If there are loose ends from your past, Kang-woo, I suggest you cut them now. Before they become knots we cannot untie. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. In their world, silence was the most common language, a shield used to hide the rot beneath the surface. He steered the car away from the main thoroughfare, taking a quiet, tree-lined route that skirted a public park. Here, the neon of the city faded, replaced by softer amber street lamps that cast long, peaceful shadows across the winter grass. It was a shortcut he took often, a path that offered a brief, 5-minute reprieve from the suffocating pressure of his office. And then, his world stopped. It wasn't a gradual realization, it was a violent, physical collision of his past and his present. Standing near a weathered wooden bench, framed by the skeletal branches of a massive oak tree, was Octavia Lennox. The air in the Mercedes suddenly felt thin, as if the car had run out of oxygen. Kang-woo's foot hovered over the brake, the heavy vehicle slowing to a crawl. Octavia. The woman whose memory he had tried to bury under a mountain of duty and blood. She stood with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby lamp. But it was the way she stood that shattered his mask. Her hand was resting, resolute, protective, and unmistakably tender, over the rounded curve of a pregnancy bump hidden beneath a simple, cream-colored cardigan. The math hit him with the force of a lead pipe. 1 year. It had been exactly 1 year since the night the elders had discovered their secret, the night they had told him that his distraction was a threat to the syndicate's future. He had been forced to choose between her life and his throne. He had chosen her safety, leaving her in the dead of night with a cold, scripted goodbye that was meant to keep her far away from the bullets of his will. He had thought he was protecting her. He had thought he was being brave. Kang-woo. Hae-rin's voice was a sudden, jarring intrusion. She was watching him now, her eyes darting from his rigid face to the window, her suspicion thickening into something dangerous. Why are you stopping? Who are you looking at? Kang-woo couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He watched Octavia through the bulletproof glass, the glass designed to keep the world out, and realized it had only succeeded in keeping him trapped inside. She looked peaceful, a woman who had built a life out of the wreckage he had left behind, carrying a secret that was half him and half the only love he had ever known. The baby. His baby. The cold luxury of the charcoal suit, the multi-billion-dollar syndicate, the powerful woman beside him, it all felt like ash in his mouth. In that single, frozen moment, the Mafia king realized that the simple, uncomplicated life he had tried to secure was a hollow lie. His heart, a muscle he had long ago trained to be silent, began to beat with a terrifying, thunderous urgency. The secret she was holding in that quiet park didn't just threaten his empire. It threatened to make him human again. The drive back to the penthouse was a blur of neon streaks and suffocating silence. Beside him, Hae-rin sat like a statue carved from ice, her suspicion radiating off her in waves that felt more jagged than the diamond on her finger. Kang-woo barely felt the leather of the steering wheel beneath his palms. His mind was still back in that park, anchored to the image of Octavia's hand resting over the curve of a child he was never supposed to know existed. Once he reached the safety of his private study, the door clicking shut with a heavy, final thud, the year of silence finally began to crumble. He didn't turn on the lights. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over a city he supposedly ruled, yet feeling like a ghost in his own life. The ghost of the park haunted every corner of the room. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that cream-colored cardigan and the unmistakable, rounded shape beneath it. 12 months. 12 months of disciplined, agonizing silence. He had convinced himself that by cutting her out of his world, he was a hero. He had been taught by the elders that a king's greatest sacrifice is his heart, and he had laid his on the altar with the cold efficiency of a soldier. His mind drifted back to that rainy night a year ago, the night the silence began. The council of elders had sat in the dim light of the traditional hanok, their faces like withered parchment, their voices rasping with the weight of centuries-old tradition. They had shown him the photographs, Octavia at a cafe, Octavia walking to her apartment, Octavia laughing. They had called her a stain on the lineage, a distraction that would lead to a bullet in the dark. For her own safety, Kang-woo, the senior elder had whispered, his eyes like those of an ancient lizard. If she remains, she is a target for our enemies. If she remains, you are weak. And in our world, the weak are slaughtered along with those they love. The ultimatum was blood-red and simple: leave her, marry into a loyal bloodline, and she lives. Stay with her, and the syndicate would ensure neither of them saw the next sunrise. Kang-woo remembered the way the rain had lashed against his face when he went to her that night. He remembered the warmth of her small apartment, the scent of cocoa butter and old books that always clung to her skin, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the clinical, metallic world he inhabited. He had stood in her doorway, his heart a lead weight in his chest, and told the most necessary lies of his life. I don't love you, Octavia, he had said, his voice as flat as a blade. You were a diversion. A luxury I can no longer afford. He had seen her soul break in her eyes, a shattering that was silent and devastating. He didn't look back as he walked away, leaving her in the ruins of a love he had been too brave to fight for. He had spent the next 365 days building a fortress of duty, convincing himself that her survival was worth his misery. But now, the math had changed. 1 year since that night. The pregnancy was advanced, resolute, and undeniable. She hadn't just survived the silence, she had carried the one thing he thought he had successfully killed, a future. The realization hit him with a physical ache that made him lean against the cold glass of the window. While he was sitting in boardrooms negotiating mergers and drinking vintage scotch with a fiancée who didn't know the color of his soul, Octavia had been navigating the world alone, carrying his child. She had attended prenatal appointments alone. She had felt the first kick alone. She had prepared for a life in the shadows because she knew his family would consider her child a liability to be erased. Year of silence hadn't been a gift of safety to her, it had been a prison sentence he had unknowingly imposed. He had thought he was protecting her from the bullets of his world, but he had left her vulnerable to the crushing weight of raising a secret heir in a city that belonged to him. Kang-woo looked at his hands in the moonlight, hands that had ordered hits and signed bidden-won contracts. They felt heavy, stained with a different kind of blood now. The Cold King was a title that felt like a mockery. He wasn't a king, he was a man who had been too afraid to challenge the elders, a man who had chosen a throne over a heartbeat. The image of Octavia in the park, quiet and dignified, wouldn't leave him. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a fortress. And for the first time in his life, Kang-woo realized that the elders were wrong. Consistency didn't build empires, truth did. And his truth was currently 5 miles away, protected by nothing but a cream-colored cardigan and the fiercest love he had ever witnessed. The year of silence was over. The question that remained was whether he was brave enough to survive the noise that was coming. The blue light of the triple monitors in Kang-woo's private sanctum was the only thing cutting through the oppressive darkness of the room. He sat motionless, his silhouette framed by the sprawling, glittering expanse of Seoul outside his window, a city he supposedly controlled, yet a city that felt like it was mocking him. He didn't call his usual security detail. Their loyalty was a curated performance, a tangled web of allegiances that ultimately led back to the Council of Elders. To find the truth, he had to step into the shadows of the underworld that even the family didn't fully monitor. He reached for a burner phone and dialed a number that hadn't been active in a year. The man on the other end, a specialist in deep due diligence, named Jin-soo, answered on the first ring. The request was simple, clinical, and devastatingly personal. Find Octavia Lennox. Track every movement, every address, and every cent she had spent in the last 12 months. This is off the grid, Kang-woo whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp in the silent room. No digital footprint left behind. If the elders find out you're looking, we both become ghosts. 24 hours of agonizing stillness followed. Kang-woo moved through his official duties like a machine, presiding over syndicate meetings and sitting through a stiff, formal dinner with Baek Hae-rin, all while his mind remained anchored to that oak tree in the park. When the encrypted file finally landed in his inbox, he felt a surge of adrenaline so sharp it was almost painful. He opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were surveillance shots that made him feel like a voyeur in a life he had forfeited the right to witness. But he couldn't stop looking. The first photograph was of a modest, brick apartment building in a quiet, working-class corner of Maple-gu, a far cry from the glass and steel penthouses of Gangnam. There was no valet, no security gate, and no bulletproof glass. The second photo showed Octavia walking to a local market. She was dressed in a simple, oversized sweater, her auburn-tinted curls pulled back. She looked tired, the shadows beneath her eyes speaking of long nights and heavy thoughts, but she moved with a dignified precision that stopped Kang-woo's heart. Even in a crowd of strangers, she carried herself like a woman who answered to no one. As he scrolled further, he looked for the one thing he expected to find, his money. When he had left her, he had arranged for a secret offshore account to be credited with enough wealth to ensure she never had to work a day in her life. He had considered it a parting gift, a way to ease his own conscience. Financial records show the offshore account remains untouched, the report read in cold, calibri font. Subject has been supporting herself entirely through freelance digital marketing contracts. No mysterious deposits. No child support. No contact with known associates. The words hit Kang-woo with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't touched a single one of his blood money. She was raising his child in a two-bedroom walk-up, working late into the night on a laptop at a kitchen table, rather than owe a single breath of her life to the man who had broken her heart for her own safety. He looked at a photo of her sitting in a small neighborhood cafe, her chin propped on her hand, a notebook open in front of her. She looked entirely unencumbered by the domestic chaos he had once feared would suffocate his ambition. She wasn't a liability, she was a fortress. She had built a wall of warmth and purpose while he was busy decorating a cage of cold luxury and strategic alliances. But it was the final image that broke the cold king. It was a grainy shot taken through her living room window at dusk. Octavia was standing near a small, wooden crib she had clearly assembled herself. She wasn't crying. She wasn't waiting. She was simply existing. Resolute. Kang-woo leaned back in his leather chair, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. He had spent the last year convinced that she was a stain on the lineage that needed to be erased for her protection. He had believed that his world was the only one that mattered. But looking at these photos, he realized that Octavia was the one who was truly powerful. She had the courage to live a life of truth, while he was drowning in a sea of beautiful, expensive lies. His phone buzzed, a text from Baek Hae-rin asking about the wedding flowers. He stared at the screen, then at the photo of Octavia near the crib. The contrast was a jagged blade in his chest. He realized then that he couldn't pretend he didn't know. The knowledge of her struggle, her fierce, independent struggle, sat in his lungs like a weight. He had thought he was protecting her from the bullets of his world, but he had left her to fight the entire world alone. And she was winning. Kang-woo closed the laptop, the blue light fading from his face, but the images remained burned into his retinas. He knew what he had to do next, even as he knew it would likely lead to his own execution. He couldn't hide behind investigators and encrypted files any longer. If those photos were a map of his failures, then the park was where he had to start his path to redemption. The underworld surveillance had given him the facts, but it had also stripped him of his last excuse. He wasn't a king protecting a subject. He was a father who had abandoned his family for a throne of glass. And as the sun began to rise over Seoul, the Mafia boss realized that he was finally brave enough to want all of it, the chaos, the struggle, and the woman who had never needed his money to be a queen. The dawn over Maple-gu did not possess the clinical, polished brilliance of Gangnam. Here, the sun climbed slowly over tangled power lines and low-slung brick buildings, its light softened by the steam of morning soup shops and the grate of a neighborhood that actually slept. Yoon Kang-woo sat in the front seat of a nondescript, silver sedan, a car chosen specifically because it was forgettable. He had traded his tailored silk suits for a dark hoodie and a cap pulled low, a king masquerading as a shadow in the corner of a world that didn't know his name. He had been there since 4 a.m., parked far enough to be invisible but close enough to see the entrance of the brick walk-up. The truth he had found in the shadows was a heavy thing, a physical weight that made his chest ache with every shallow breath. He watched the front door, his eyes never wavering, waiting for the woman who had become the center of his fractured world to step into the light. When the door finally opened, Kang-woo's heart did something it hadn't done in years. It faltered. Octavia emerged, looking like a quiet revolution against the drab pavement. She was dressed for a long day of work, her auburn curls tucked into a neat, professional bun. She carried a heavy-looking shoulder bag and a reusable grocery sack, her movements cautious and deliberate. From this distance, the pregnancy was even more undeniable than it had been in the park. It was alive, a real, tangible presence that had been growing and thriving while he had been playing at being a god in his high-rise office. He watched her walk toward the bus stop. It was only 3 blocks, but to Kang-woo, it looked like a pilgrimage. Halfway there, she stopped. She didn't look around for help. She simply placed her bags on a low stone wall and rested a hand against her lower back, her head bowed as she took a slow, steadying breath. Kang-woo's hand went to the door handle, his knuckles white with the instinct to run to her, to take the weight from her hands, to offer the bulletproof comfort and heated seats of his Mercedes. But he stopped. The realization hit him like a shot of glass in the lungs. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was the reason she was standing on a dusty sidewalk in Maple-gu, catching her breath alone. He had missed it all. As he watched her, he began to do the agonizing mental arithmetic of his absence. He had missed the first 12 weeks of morning sickness, the moments of dizzying exhaustion when she had likely needed someone to hold her hair or bring her water. He had missed the first sonogram, the grainy black and white image of a flickering heartbeat that he would have surely framed in gold. He had missed the second trimester, the glow his mother used to talk about, and the first time the baby had shifted or kicked against her ribs. While he was negotiating territorial disputes and securing his empire with Hae-rin by his side, Octavia had been navigating the terrifying bureaucracy of healthcare and the lonely milestones of a first pregnancy. She had likely stood in line at the pharmacy alone. She had sat in waiting rooms filled with couples, her hand the only one resting on her stomach while others held their partners. A delivery truck rumbled past, momentarily obscuring his view. When it cleared, he saw an older neighbor with a shopping cart approach Octavia. They exchanged a few words, a brief moment of neighborhood kindness as the older woman gestured to Octavia's bags. Octavia smiled, a small, tired, but genuinely grateful expression, and declined the help with a gentle shake of her head. That smile was a blade in Kang-woo's side. It was the smile of a woman who had learned to survive, and even thrive, without him. It was the smile of a fortress. He realized then that his sacrifice a year ago hadn't been an act of protection. It had been an act of profound cowardice. He had chosen the safety of his throne because it was easier than challenging the elders, easier than building a world where a black woman and a Korean syndicate leader could raise a child in the light. He had left her to face the entire world alone, and in doing so, he had forfeited the right to the very legacy he was now so desperate to claim. Octavia picked up her bags and continued toward the bus stop, her gait slightly swaying with the new weight of her body. She looked beautiful, not the curated, sterile beauty of Hae-rin, but the raw, grounded magnificence that made the bustling street around her look like a blur. Kang-woo watched the bus pull up, watched her navigate the steep steps with practiced care, and watched the vehicle pull away into the morning traffic. He remained in the silver sedan for a long time after she was gone, the silence of the car feeling like a tomb. The truth was no longer a shadow, it was a blinding, unforgiving light. He had spent his life believing that consistency and power were the markers of a man. But as he looked at the empty sidewalk where Octavia had stood, he realized that he was the weakest man in Seoul. He had missed months of a life that was half his. He had missed the transformation of the woman he loved into the mother of his child. He couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. To remain a spectator was to continue the abandonment. As he started the engine of the nondescript car, the Cold King felt the last of his ice melt away, replaced by a searing, desperate fire. He didn't just want to protect her anymore. He wanted to earn the right to stand beside her. He wanted to be the man who carried the bags, who sat in the waiting rooms, and who earned the smile she had given the stranger on the street. The empire he had built suddenly looked like a pile of dusty glass. It was time to stop watching and start acting, even if it meant burning the throne to the ground to keep his family warm. The walk up to the third floor of the Maple-gu apartment building felt longer than any ascent to a boardroom or a syndicate throne. The air in the narrow stairwell smelled of sesame oil and laundry detergent, a domestic symphony that felt alien to a man who lived in a world of metallic scents and sterile silence. Yoon Kang-woo stood before the door of apartment 3B, his hand hovering inches from the scarred wood. For the first time in his life, his fingers trembled. The Cold King was gone, replaced by a man who felt like a trespasser in a life he had once shared. He knocked. The sound was soft, yet it echoed in the quiet hallway like a gunshot. He heard the muffled sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then, the click of a deadbolt. The door swung open, and the breath he had been holding escaped in a ragged rush. Octavia stood there, framed by the warm, amber light of her living room. She wasn't wearing the professional bun he had seen at the bus stop, her hair was loose, a dark halo around a face that had haunted his dreams for 365 days. She looked at him, and there was no scream, no gasp of shock. There was only a wall of quiet, devastating recognition. "Kang-woo," she said. Her voice was steady, a low vibration that vibrated in his chest. I wondered if the shadows would eventually take a human shape. "Octavia." He struggled to find a voice he used to command thousands. It filled him, leaving only a hoarse whisper. "I saw you. In the park." She didn't move to let him in, standing as a resolute guardian of the threshold. Her hand went instinctively to the rounded curve of her stomach, a gesture of protective fierceness that made Kang-woo's eyes sting. Up close, the reality of her pregnancy was a visceral blow. He could see the strain in her shoulders and the new, maternal depth in her gaze. She was a fortress, and he was the invading force she had already defeated once. "And now that you've seen," she said, her green eyes searching his face for the lies she expected to find, "what is it you want? Did you come to offer more blood money? Or did the elders send you to finish the job?" "I didn't know," he said, stepping forward unbidden. "Octavia, I swear to you, I didn't know about the child. I thought I was protecting you. I thought leaving you was the only way to keep you alive." "Protecting me?" Octavia's laugh was short and sharp, a jagged blade of sound. She stepped back, finally allowing him into the small space, not out of welcome, but to keep the conversation from the neighbors' ears. The apartment was small but filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in a year. A half-assembled crib sat in the corner, and a stack of books on infant care lay on the coffee table. "You left me in the middle of the night with a scripted lie and a cold heart. You didn't protect me, Kang-woo. You protected your crown. You looked at the life we could have had and decided it wasn't worth the risk to your empire." It was for the Syndicate, he argued, the old patterns of his life rising up like a shield. "They would have killed you. They would have used you to get to me. And instead, you used me," she countered, her voice gaining a terrifying, quiet strength. "You used my love as a casualty of your war. You left me to navigate doctors, and bills, and the sheer, paralyzing fear of being a mother to a child whose father is a ghost. I have spent months learning how to be a parent, while you were busy being a king." Kang-woo looked at the crib, then back at her. The cold king persona began to crumble in earnest. He saw the independent life she had built, the freelance contracts, the modest furniture, the untouched offshore account. She had survived the year of silence by becoming everything he had been too afraid to be: brave, honest, and free. "I want to make it right," he said, his voice cracking. "I want to be a father to this child. I want to provide for you both." Octavia took a step toward him, her shadow falling long across the floor. "You think fatherhood is a contract you can sign? You think you can walk in here after a year of silence and claim a stake in a life you abandoned? You forfeited your right to this child the moment you chose that throne over us. This baby doesn't belong to the Syndicate. This baby doesn't belong to the family lineage. This child is mine." "He's half mine," Kang-woo whispered, his hand reaching out tentatively, though he didn't dare touch her. "Biologically, perhaps," she said, her expression hardening into something unbreakable. "But a father is someone who stays when the rain starts. A father is someone who doesn't hire investigators to watch from the shadows because he's too afraid to knock on the door. You are a stranger to this child, Kang-woo. You are a man who cares more about consistency and power than a heartbeat." The words hit him like physical blows. He looked at her, at the woman he loved, who had become a goddess of resilience in his absence, and realized that she was right. He had been a coward masquerading as a martyr. He had missed the transformation of his son or daughter from a hope into a reality because he was too busy decorating his own cage. "I'm not that man anymore," he said, the desperation leaking into his tone. "Seeing you, it changed everything. I'm ready to leave it all. The syndicate, the merger, the throne. I'll burn it all down if it means I can be here." Octavia studied him, her gaze lingering on the dark circles under his eyes and the way his hands wouldn't stop shaking. For a moment, the wall softened, a flicker of the woman who had once loved him appearing in the depths of her eyes. But then, she looked at the crypt, and the fortress returned. "Then burn it," she said quietly. "But don't do it for me. Do it for yourself. Because right now, you have nothing to offer this child but a legacy of blood and a father who is a target. You say you want to be a father? Prove it. Not with money, and not with shadow surveillance. Prove you can be a man who doesn't run when the elders speak." She moved toward the door, her hand on the knob. The 5 minutes were up. "You have no right to a child you abandoned for a throne, Kang-woo. Not yet. Maybe not ever." He walked out into the cold hallway, the click of the deadbolt behind him sounding like the final gavel of a judge. The cold king was dead, buried under the weight of his own failures. As he descended the stairs, Kang-woo realized that the confrontation hadn't been an end, but a beginning. He didn't just want to be a father, he had to earn the right to be human. And as he stepped out into the Maple-gu night, the Mafia boss realized that to save his family, he first had to destroy the king. The high-rise headquarters of the Yoon Syndicate was a monolith of glass and tempered steel, a place where the air was filtered to a chilling purity and the silence was heavy with the weight of unspoken death sentences. Yoon Kang-woo sat at his desk, the city of Seoul sprawling beneath him like a circuit board, but his eyes were fixed on the scarred wood of his own palms. He could still feel the phantom vibration of the deadbolt clicking shut in Maple-gu. He could still smell the faint, lingering scent of cocoa butter and old books that had clung to Octavia's skin, a scent that stood in violent opposition to the metallic, sterile environment he called home. He was distracted, and in his world, distraction was a scent that predators could pick up from miles away. Baek Hae-rin did not knock when she entered. She moved with the predatory elegance of a snow leopard, her silk dress whispering against the polished marble floors. She didn't sit, she stood by the window, her reflection ghosting over the skyline. For a long moment, she said nothing, but the silence between them was no longer the comfortable, strategic void they had shared for months. It was a sharpened blade, hovering inches from his throat. "The floral arrangements for the gala were finalized today," she said, her voice a low, clinical hum. "White lilies and orchids. Symbols of purity and rebirth. The elders found the choice appropriate for a merger of our magnitude." Kang-woo didn't look up. "Good. Is it?" Hae-rin turned, her gaze sweeping over him with the precision of a laser. "You've been back in this office for 3 hours, Kang-woo, and you haven't opened a single file. You missed the briefing with the Busan associates. You didn't even notice that your tea has gone cold." She stepped closer, the heavy diamond on her finger catching the fluorescent lights, casting a jagged spark across his desk. "You smell of the street, Kang-woo. You smell of cheap laundry detergent and rain. You smell of a life that does not belong in this tower." Kang-woo finally raised his eyes, his mask of the cold king sliding back into place, though it felt heavier and more ill-fitting than ever before. "I am handling personal matters, Hae-rin. My focus on the merger has not wavered." "Do not lie to me," she snapped, the icy grace of her persona cracking to reveal the steel beneath. We are not just a couple, we are a multi-billion-won architecture of power. If one pillar leans, the entire structure collapses. I notice your distraction in the car near the park. I noticed the way your pulse spiked when you looked at that woman. She walked behind him, her hand resting on the back of his leather chair. He could feel the coldness of her ring through his suit jacket. I didn't reach my position by waiting for men to tell me the truth. While you were playing at being a ghost in Maple, I had my own people tracing your route. It took exactly 45 minutes to find the address. Apartment 3B. Kang-woo froze. The air in the room seemed to solidify into ice. Octavia Lennox, Baek Hae-rin whispered, the name sounding like a curse in her refined accent. The black woman the elders told you to erase a year ago. I must admit, I was impressed by her resilience. Most women broken by a man like you would have vanished or withered. But she has grown quite substantial, hasn't she? Baek Hae-rin moved back to the front of the desk, reaching into her designer clutch and sliding a single, high-resolution photograph across the mahogany. It was a shot taken from across the street in Maple, Octavia, standing at her window, the light of the setting sun illuminating the unmistakable, protective curve of her pregnancy. The math is quite simple, even for someone as distracted as you, Baek Hae-rin said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. 1 year since your sacrifice. A pregnancy that looks to be in its final trimester. You didn't just leave a lover behind, Kang-woo. You left a legacy. A secret heir to the Yoon bloodline, carried by a woman who doesn't even have a seat at our table. Leave her out of this, Kang-woo commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She is nothing to the Syndicate. She wants no part of this world. It doesn't matter what she wants. Baek Hae-rin slammed her hand onto the desk, the diamond ring clicking against the wood like a gavel. In our world, her existence is a provocation. That child is a biological claim to your throne. If the elders find out you've been visiting a hidden family, if they find out you've kept a mixed blood heir a secret while negotiating a merger based on the purity of our lineage, they won't just kill her. They will erase every trace that either of you ever existed. She leaned in, her eyes burning with a mixture of professional fury and a cold, strategic jealousy. I have a duty to my family, Kang-woo. I will not have my marriage turn into a farce, and I will not have my merger tanked by a sentimental mistake you made in a moment of weakness. You have 48 hours to finalize the paperwork for our union and cut this tie once and for all. And if I don't? Baek Hae-rin straightened her silk blazer, her composure returning like a shroud. Then I will go to the Council of Elders myself. I will present them with this photograph and the address. I will tell them that their king is compromised, that his heart is in a walk-up in Maple rather than on the throne. You know how they handle distractions, Kang-woo. They don't negotiate. They incinerate. She turned toward the door, pausing only to look back over her shoulder. You think you're being a hero by visiting her in the dark. But you are the one bringing the shadow to her door. Choose the crown, or choose the grave. But don't think for a second you can have both. The door closed with a soft, clinical click. Kang-woo was alone again, the blue light of his monitors reflecting off the photograph of Octavia. He looked at her hand resting on her stomach, then at the heavy diamond Baek Hae-rin had left a phantom impression of on his desk. The cold king was trapped. The secret that was supposed to destroy his empire had already been weaponized, and the woman who was meant to be his partner was now the person holding the knife to his family's throat. The year of silence was truly over. The noise was here, and it was screaming for blood. The drizzling rain over Maplegu felt like a million cold needles against Kang-woo's skin as he stepped out of the nondescript sedan. He had ignored the 48-hour ultimatum from Baek Hae-rin, just as he had ignored the 17 missed calls from the Syndicate's chief of staff. The blue light of the high-rise tower, the sterile perfection of his charcoal suits, and the ironclad logic of his empire felt like a fever dream he was finally waking from. He didn't look like a king tonight. His hair was damp, his shoulders were heavy with a fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, and his eyes held a desperate, flickering humanity that would have terrified the Council of Elders. He reached the third floor and stood before the door of apartment 3B. He didn't knock with the authority of a boss. He tapped softly, a man asking for entry into a sanctuary he had no right to claim. When the door opened, Octavia didn't look angry. She looked at him with a weary, knowing sadness that was far more painful. She was wearing an oversized sweater the color of autumn leaves, and the warmth of her small living room spilled out into the hallway, smelling of ginger tea and the quiet, ordinary life he had spent a year trying to forget. Hae-rin knows, he said, the words a raw confession before he even crossed the threshold. She found the address. She's threatening to go to the council. Octavia's hand went instinctively to her stomach, her green eyes narrowing not with fear, but with a terrifying, protective resolve. She stepped back, allowing him inside. The apartment felt smaller tonight, or perhaps he simply felt larger, a jagged, metallic intruder in a space built for peace. He sat on the edge of the small, velvet sofa, his hands clasped between his knees to hide their trembling. So, the shadows are closing in, Octavia said quietly, sitting in the armchair opposite him. She didn't offer him tea. She didn't offer him comfort. What is your plan, Kang-woo? Are you here to say goodbye again? Are you here to tell me that for my safety, I need to vanish into the night? No, he whispered, looking at the half-assembled crib in the corner. I'm here because I realize I can't breathe in that tower anymore. I'm here because every second I'm away from you, I'm dying, and I didn't even know it. He looked at her, his mask of the cold king finally cracking wide open. I don't want the throne, Octavia. I don't want the merger. I want to be the man who carries the bags. I want to be the man who is here when the rain starts. But I don't know if I'm brave enough to survive the war it will take to get there. Octavia studied him for a long time, the silence of the room filled only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the patter of rain against the window. She saw the truth in the hollows of his cheeks and the way his gaze clung to her as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting into the abyss. Slowly, she stood and moved toward him. She didn't stop until her knees were inches from his. Give me your hand, she commanded softly. Kang-woo hesitated, his fingers hovering in the air as if afraid he might tarnish her with the blood that stayed on his palms no matter how hard he scrubbed. She reached out, her skin warm and soft against his, and guided his hand to the rounded, firm curve of her stomach. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the heat of her body through the wool of her sweater. And then, it happened. A sharp, rhythmic thud against his palm. A small, unmistakable movement from within, a life reaching out to acknowledge his presence. Kang-woo's breath hitched. He felt an electric shock surge through his system, a sensation so visceral and pure that it obliterated every quarterly projection and territorial map in his mind. This wasn't a legacy. This wasn't a mixed blood heir. This was a person. A tiny, fierce life that carried his stubbornness and Octavia's strength, kicking against the hand of the man who had almost let them slip away. He's awake, Octavia whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could no longer hide. Another kick followed, stronger this time. Kang-woo slumped forward, his forehead coming to rest against Octavia's shoulder as his hand remained anchored to the life he had missing for so long. The Mafia boss persona, the skin he had worn for 15 years to protect himself from the world, didn't just crack, it crumbled into ash. He wasn't Yoon Kang-woo, the cold king of the Seoul underworld. He was just a man. A father. A partner who had failed and was finally, desperately, trying to find his way home. A single, hot tear escaped and soaked into the wool of her sweater. Octavia didn't pull away. She rested her hand over his, her fingers intertwining with the man she had loved and lost, and then found again in the ruins of his own empire. "I can't go back," he choked out, his voice muffled against her. "I won't go back." "If you stay," Octavia said, her voice a low, steady warning, "it won't be like your stories. There are no bulletproof windows here. There is just us, and a world that will try to tear us apart because we dared to choose something real." Kang-woo raised his head, his eyes red but clear, filled with a purpose that had nothing to do with power. He looked at Octavia, at the woman who had survived his cowardice and become a fortress, and then down at his hand, where the baby kicked once more as if in agreement. "Then let them come," he said, his voice regaining a different kind of strength, a strength born of love rather than fear. "I've spent my life building a throne of glass. I'd rather die on the floor of this apartment with you than live another day as a king in a cage." The choice was made. It wasn't a strategic decision, and it wasn't a business negotiation. It was a surrender. As he sat there in the quiet of Maple-gu, Kang-woo realized that the chaos Octavia lived in was the only life worth living. He had 48 hours to burn his world to the ground, but as he held his family in the amber light, he knew he didn't need that much time. He was already gone. The air inside the council's traditional hanok was thick with the scent of aged cedar and the bitter, medicinal aroma of ceremonial tea. It was a space designed to stifle the individual, a room where the centuries-old weight of the Yoon lineage hung from the rafters like invisible nooses. The elders sat in a perfect semicircle, their faces as immobile as stone masks, watching as the final merger documents were laid out on the low silk-covered table. Beside them, Baek Hae-rin stood like an empress in waiting, her eyes tracking the movement of the calligraphy brush with a predatory hunger. She looked at Kang-woo as he entered, her expression a mix of triumph and a warning, a silent reminder of the 48-hour clock she had set. Kang-woo moved with a slow, deliberate grace that drew every eye in the room. He didn't look like a man about to commit professional suicide. He looked like a man who had finally found the ground beneath his feet. His suit was impeccable, but the cold king who usually inhabited it was gone. In his place was a man still feeling the phantom rhythm of a child's kick against his palm, a rhythm that made the heavy silence of the council feel utterly hollow. "The time for hesitation is over," Kang-woo, the senior elder rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "The Baek family is ready. The merger is the culmination of 3 generations of effort. Sign, and your legacy is etched in stone. Refuse, and you are nothing but a footnote in a history that will forget you." Kang-woo looked down at the documents. The ink was black and deep, a liquid darkness that promised power at the cost of his soul. He thought of the walk-up in Maple-gu. He thought of the way Octavia's eyes had softened when he leaned against her shoulder, and the fierce, independent life she had built in the ruins of his cowardice. He realized that the stone the elder spoke of wasn't a monument, it was a tombstone. "I'm not signing," Kang-woo said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Hae-rin's composure didn't just crack, it shattered. She stepped forward, her voice a hissed intake of breath. "Kang-woo, think very carefully about what you are doing. You are not just refusing a wedding. You are declaring war. I am not signing, Kang-woo repeated, his voice gaining a terrifying, resonant clarity that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the hanok. He looked directly at the senior elder, ignoring the gasps of the lesser syndicate members. I have spent 15 years building a throne out of glass and ice. I have sacrificed people I love and parts of myself that I can never get back, all for the sake of a consistency that is nothing more than a slow death. I am finished with it. You are compromised, the elder hissed, his eyes narrowing into slits. The woman. The distraction in Maple-gu. You would trade the Yoon Empire for a mixed-blood mistake? Kang-woo stepped toward the table, his shadow falling long across the documents. She is not a mistake. And that child is not a distraction. They are my family. The only family I have that isn't built on a foundation of blood and fear. He turned to Hae-rin, whose face was pale with a cold, calculated fury. Go to the council, Hae-rin. Tell them everything. Tell them that their king is gone. But know this, Octavia Lennox and my child are under my protection. From this moment forward, any hand raised against them is a hand raised against me. And unlike the king you knew, I have nothing left to lose. I will burn every high-rise in this city to the ground before I let you touch them. He picked up the calligraphy brush, but he didn't sign the contract. Instead, he drew a single, jagged line through the center of the documents, a black scar that signaled the end of the merger and the start of a war. You won't leave this room a free man, the senior elder warned, as the guards at the door shifted, their hands moving toward the weapons concealed in their jackets. Kang-woo didn't reach for a gun. He simply looked at them with an expression of such profound, unburdened peace that they hesitated. I have never been freer than I am at this moment, he said. He began to walk toward the door, his heart beating with the fierce, wild urgency of a man who finally had something worth fighting for. The year of silence is over. If you want a war, you'll find me in the light, not the shadows. As he stepped out of the hanok and into the biting soul air, the breaking point was complete. He had no empire, no merger, and 1,000 targets on his back. But as he looked toward the horizon where Maple-gu lay, Kang-woo realized he had finally earned the right to be a father. He had traded a crown for a heartbeat, and for the first time in his life, the price felt cheap. The final stand did not begin with a gunshot or a scream. It began with the cold, rhythmic clicking of a keyboard in a room that smelled of old dust and desperate hope. Yoon Kang-woo sat in a secondary safe house, a cramped basement in the labyrinthine alleys of Incheon, surrounded by monitors that flickered with the data streams of a billion-won empire. He had traded the charcoal silk of his custom suits for a tactical jacket, the weight of the silver cufflinks replaced by the cold, heavy reality of a Beretta holstered at his hip. He looked at the screen, the blue light reflecting in eyes that no longer held the hollow chill of the king, but the searing, focused fire of a father. He knew exactly how the council would move. They were creatures of habit, bound by the very consistency they preached. Within hours of his defiance, they would have frozen his primary accounts and dispatched the cleaners to Maple-gu. But Kang-woo had spent 15 years building their traps. He knew where every tripwire was hidden because he had been the one to set them. You're playing a dangerous game, Kang-woo, Jin-soo whispered from the shadows of the basement, his fingers flying across a secondary terminal. You aren't just quitting. You're erasing them. If this fails, there won't be enough left of you to bury. It won't fail, Kang-woo said, his voice a low, resonant vibration. Because they are fighting for power, and I am fighting for a heartbeat. They don't know how to handle someone who has already made peace with his own ending. His tactical brilliance, once used to expand territories and swallow rivals, was now turned inward. He didn't send soldiers to the council's gates, he sent ghosts into their machines. With a single, decisive keystroke, he triggered the kill switches he had secretly embedded in the merger's financial architecture years ago. In an instant, the multi-billion-won contracts with the Baek family didn't just stall, they vanished into a black hole of encrypted offshore accounts that only Kang-woo could access. He watched the data lines flatline on the screen. He had just decapitated the Syndicate's wealth. Without the merger and without the liquid assets he had diverted, the elders were no longer gods of the underworld. They were just old men in a drafty hanok, suddenly vulnerable to the dozens of smaller factions they had spent decades oppressing. But the financial strike was only the first move. To save Octavia, he had to burn the soul of the Syndicate. Kang-woo opened a final, encrypted file labeled Legacy. It contained decades of the elders' darkest transgressions, the murders, the bribes, the systematic poisoning of the city's political foundations. He didn't send it to the police, who were already in the Syndicate's pocket. He sent it to the public, to the hungry journalists and the rising activist groups who couldn't be silenced by a bribe. He watched the upload progress bar climb, realizing that with every percentage point, he was dismantling the very world that had made him. He was destroying his history to ensure his child could have a future. "It's done," Jin-soo said, his voice hushed with awe and terror. "The National Tax Service is already mobilizing. The prosecution has no choice but to act. The Yoon name, it's going to be synonymous with the greatest scandal in the country's history." "Good," Kang-woo replied. He stood up, the chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Let the name die. I have a different one to earn." The final stand moved from the digital to the physical as he drove through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, heading toward Maple-gu. He knew Hae-rin wouldn't go down without a fight. She was a predator who valued her status above all else, and he had just turned her crowning achievement into a radioactive liability. He reached Octavia's building just as a black sedan with tinted windows pulled into the alley. He didn't wait for them to exit. He moved with a terrifying, fluid precision, the cold king reborn as a guardian. He intercepted the three enforcers before they reached the stairwell, his movements a blur of tactical efficiency. There was no room for mercy tonight. He disarmed the first with a bone-shattering strike, used the second as a shield against the third, and neutralized them all in a span of 30 seconds. He wasn't fighting for territory or respect. He was fighting for the 5 minutes of peace he had felt with his hand on Octavia's stomach. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. When he reached apartment 3B, he didn't knock. He burst through the door, his weapon drawn, only to find Octavia standing in the center of the room, her hand resting over her belly, her green eyes filled with a terrifying, calm resolve. She held a kitchen knife in her other hand, ready to defend the life within her until her last breath. When she saw him, the knife didn't drop, but her shoulders slumped with a relief that was visible even in the dim light. "You came," she whispered. "I told you," he said, holstering his weapon and moving toward her, his boots tracking the rain and the grit of the war he had just started. "I'm done with the shadows. The city is screaming, Kang-woo," she said, nodding toward the window where the distant sirens were already beginning to wail. "What have you done?" "I burned the throne," he said, reaching out to take her hand. He didn't smell of the high-rise tower anymore, he smelled of the street, of the rain, and of a man who had finally found his soul in the wreckage of his empire. "The Syndicate is over. The elders will be in handcuffs by morning, and Hae-rin will be fighting for her own survival. We have a window." A few hours to disappear before the world realizes I'm the one who pulled the trigger. And then what? She asked, her gaze searching his face for the man he was becoming. And then, he said, pulling her close, his forehead resting against hers as the baby gave a small, acknowledging kick against his side, we learn how to be a family in the light. No more secrets. No more family heritage. Just us. As they moved toward the door, leaving the modest apartment and the half-assembled creek behind for a future they would have to build from scratch, Kang-woo realized that his tactical brilliance hadn't saved his empire. It had destroyed it. And as he looked at Octavia, the woman who had taught him that consistency was a lie and love was the only truth, he knew he had made the most successful deal of his life. He had traded a crown for a soul, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the noise. The salt-heavy breeze of the East Sea swept through the open windows of the coastal cottage, carrying with it the scent of sun-warmed pine and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the tide. It was a sound that had replaced the low hum of server rooms and the screech of tires on Seoul's rain-slick asphalt. Yoon Kang-woo stood on the wooden deck, his hands, once famous for signing death warrants and billion-won mergers, now callous from the honest, grinding work of restoring the old cedar siding. He wasn't wearing charcoal silk today. He wore a faded cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the scars on his forearms that served as the only remaining maps of the war he had fought to get here. He looked out toward the horizon where the blue of the water met the pale morning sky, a vast expanse of light that didn't feel like a cage. 2 years had passed since the night he had triggered the kill switches and watched his empire burn from a basement in Incheon. The Syndicate was a ghost now, its bones picked clean by prosecutors and rival factions, its elders serving out life sentences in a prison where their lineage meant nothing. Baek Hae-rin had vanished into the corporate ether of Europe, her reputation salvaged only by the distance she had placed between herself and the Yoon scandal. To the world, Yoon Kang-woo was a casualty of the greatest corporate collapse in Korean history. To the people in this quiet fishing village, he was simply the man who lived in the cottage on the cliff, the one who looked at his wife and son as if they were made of starlight. He's trying to feed the dog his breakfast again, Octavia's voice drifted out from the kitchen, accompanied by the bright, melodic sound of her laughter. Kang-woo turned, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, a real smile that reached eyes that had finally learned how to rest. He stepped inside the house, the floorboards creaking with a familiar, welcoming warmth. The space was filled with the evidence of a life built in the light, a half-finished wooden horse he was carving in the corner, a stack of Octavia's marketing strategy books on the coffee table, and the vibrant, messy colors of a toddler's world scattered across the rug. Octavia was standing by the kitchen island, her auburn curls catching the morning light. She looked radiant, the weariness of her year in Maplegu replaced by a deep, grounded peace. She was no longer a fortress under siege, she was a woman who had seen the king fall and helped the man stand back up. In her arms, she held Junho, a 2-year-old whirlwind of energy with Kang-woo's sharp, inquisitive eyes and Octavia's resolute chin. I think he inherited your negotiation skills, Kang-woo said, stepping closer to press a kiss to Octavia's temple before ruffling his son's hair. He's already convinced the golden retriever that he's the primary food source. Junho babbled a response, a mixture of toddler Korean and English that only his parents could truly translate, before reaching out to grab Kang-woo's finger with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Kang-woo froze for a heartbeat, the sensation always bringing him back to that night in the apartment when he had first felt that kick against his palm. He looked at his son, the boy who would never know the scent of a hammock filled with medicinal tea or the crushing weight of a Syndicate throne. Junho would grow up knowing the sound of the ocean, the feel of the earth under his feet, and the knowledge that his father was a man who stayed when the rain started. What are you thinking about? Octavia asked softly, resting her head against his shoulder. I was thinking about the family legacy, Kang-woo admitted, his voice a low, resonant hum. The elders spent 70 years trying to build something that would last forever. They thought power was the only thing that could survive the passage of time. They thought an empire was the only way to be remembered. He looked around the modest kitchen, at the scratch table where they ate their meals and the small window that looked out over the sea. They were wrong. An empire is just a beautiful cage made of glass and ice. It doesn't keep you warm, and it doesn't love you back when you're tired. He took Junho from her arms, the boy settling against his chest with a sigh of complete, unburdened security. Kang-woo felt the small, rhythmic heartbeat against his own and realized that this was the only legacy that mattered. He hadn't lost an empire, he had escaped one. He had traded a throne for a home, and a crown for the right to be human. Do you ever miss it? Octavia asked, though her eyes told him she already knew the answer. The life where everyone bowed when you walked into the room. Never, Kang-woo said, and he meant it with every fiber of his soul. I miss who I thought I was supposed to be, sometimes, the version of me that was simple and cold. But I love the man I am with you. I love the chaos of this life. I love that I don't know what's coming next, but I know who I'm facing it with. They walked out onto the deck together, watching the sun climb higher over the East Sea. Year of Silence was a lifetime ago, a dark chapter in a book they had both finished reading. The noise of the world was still out there, but here, under the wide open sky, it was just background music to the extraordinary business of loving each other. Kang-woo looked down at the child in his arms and the woman by his side, the two people who had taught him that consistency wasn't about power, it was about showing up. He had spent his life fighting for a throne, only to find that the most successful deal he had ever negotiated was the one where he gave it all away. As the wind picked up, carrying the laughter of his son and the promise of a long, ordinary day ahead, the former Mafia boss realized he hadn't just saved his soul. He had finally found his way home.